Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your presence for today's panel discussion on the historical founding of Days of the Brothers of St. Joseph. In our oral today, it reads that today is the official day, July 15, 1820, the foundation of the Brothers of St. Joseph. So when we were planning this year of celebrating the Brothers of St. Joseph, we specifically want to target today, July 15th, because of the historical reasons behind that. We also wanted to have all the chairs in the chapel filled. That was our intention, but the COVID-19 changed everything for us in many, many ways. So just recently we have remembered Brothers Andre Botte, Vincent Pio, and last Sunday Anselm. These were all brothers of St. Joseph who became brothers of Holy Cross. They set the foundation for the brothers in the congregation. During this Jubilee year of the brothers, we have been celebrating and commemorating the lives of the brothers of St. Joseph and their tireless effort to bring about the ideals of Dujarric and Moreau. We thank the early members of our congregation for helping to make our congregation what it is today. May all of us in our daily prayers remember to pray for the welfare and the future of our congregation. May all of us have a grateful heart to God our Creator, who guided the various aspects of our congregation for these past 200 years. Today we are privileged to have Brothers Philip Smith, Father James Connelly, and Brother George Klawitter, who will shed more light on the Brothers of St. Joseph. Brother Philip will speak on the relationship between Dujarric and Andre Botte. Father James Connelly will speak on the inspiration to start the Brothers of St. Joseph, and Brother George will speak on the schools run by the Brothers of St. Joseph. So each panelist will give his presentation, and then after all three presentations have been made, there will be time for questions and comments. So I now turn it over to Brother Philip.
Thank you. The title of my presentation is Inflexible of Character and Semper Fidelis, the relationship between Andre Botte and Jacques Dujarric. In order to form any impression of or insight into the relationship between Andre Botte and Jacques Dujarric, one needs to read Botte's extant letters and interface their content with what has been written about Dujarric, not necessarily that written by Dujarric. There is not much source material for either man. Brother George Klawitter has translated 44 of the 51 Botte letters and written the history of the Brothers of St. Joseph, in which Botte is given more space than in any other source. The Cotta brothers, Henri Bergeron, Edward Smith, Ephraim O'Dwyer, Phileas Vanier, Marcel Fortune, and Joseph Santo are among those who have written biographies of Dujarric. They offer up little, if any, detailed insight into the personal relationship that developed between the founder of the Brothers of St. Joseph and Andre Botte. My reflection on their 18-year relationship from 1820 to Dujarric's death in 1838 will be based upon a few phrases dropped here and there throughout the above-mentioned sources. When the two men met in 1820, there was a 33-year age difference between them. Jacques Dujarric decided to enter the seminary when he was 20 years old, and Andre Botte showed up in Bruyères-sur-Loire when he was 20 years old. For each, it took only 20 years of living to realize God's call and respond to it. Once their hands were put to the Lord's plow, there was no turning back. Semper Fidelis. Their deferential yet honest fraternal relationship dramatically shaped the earliest years of the now 200 years of the Congregation of Holy Cross. Persons who study relationship building agree that to develop a deep bond with another, one needs to take time to get to know the other, listen effectively to that person, show genuine interest in the other, and be accepting of what the other has to offer to the relationship. There must be an active and mutual desire to understand what motivates another to act, which differs for each individual. Obviously, building relationships takes conscientious effort and concerted empathy. More so, relationships are much more challenging when there is a wide age difference between two persons, because the relationship can be weakened or stifled if there are unresolved trust issues. It is apparent to me that Brother André Motet and Father Jacques Dujarier had no lack of trust in each other. André was a spiritual son, and Dujarier was a spiritual father, mentor, and confidant. Both men maintained a fraternal bond as members of a religious community. The younger man came to the Brothers of St. Joseph to serve in whatever way Dujarier desired. He must have had a great deal of intestinal fortitude, self-assurance, and resolve to take on the role of teacher-administrator when still 20, untested and a member of the community for only 3 months. Coming from a farming family formed in that tenacity demanded of those who rely upon their brawn and brain to deal with the ferocity of Mother Nature, might summon up on any given day, André was well tested in the ways of resilience, disappointment, and patience. Arriving at Briey armed with a rudimentary education in reading, writing, and numbers, Motet so impressed Father Dujarier that he had him start a school in the village. Because he had no formal training as a teacher and only that rudimentary education, just what is it that Dujarier so early on saw in André that convinced him that he would be an adequate teacher and that he could be put in charge of a new school? There must have been early evidence of what in 1856 Basil Moreau would write about in Christian education as the call to be a teacher. Motet must have manifested virtues like faithfulness, the duty to form citizens for the state and citizens for heaven. Brother André demonstrated enough knowledge to teach rudimentary reading, writing, and numbers. He must have proven his zeal for the performance of the various tasks he was assigned as part of living in community that confirmed that he possessed the discipline for the relentless work of daily class preparation and consistent and timely assessment of student work. Moreau writes about the virtue of vigilance, to be ever watchful for the welfare of students and for oneself as teacher. Brother André also possessed a seriousness that usually comes from the mental maturity and wisdom of one far older than 20. He must have been a young man of a gentle nature, and with this quality he would become a teacher whose authority is grounded in meekness and empathy. It goes without saying that he was a man of patience, quote, which is the only thing that permits a teacher to rise above the difficulties inherent in educating youth, end quote. If these virtues were practiced by Motet, then I assume too that he was a prudent man, possessing a virtue that informs the best practices for the classroom. Finally, Moreau writes about firmness, which allows for the creation of a learning community that conditions students for success. All these virtues in varying degrees of development must have been manifested in not only the way Brother André lived his life, but also how he related to the other brothers and their founder. These were the qualities that Motet would take to the Christian brothers for refinement. In 1823, just 3 years after he entered, and in his 23rd year, there were 30 Brothers of St. Joseph and about 10 schools. Brother André Motet, acting as one of the 4 assistant brothers for the founder, was given rule over all. Father Dujarier was 57 years old when André arrived in Briey in 1820. From his early years, he wanted to be a priest, and he lived through some very terrible times during the French Revolution to achieve ordination. His various biographies use adjectives like capable, pious, honest, and sincere to describe the boy Dujarier.
He grew into a young man who did not shy away from danger and personal sacrifice to obtain a goal. In a word, he was tenacious to do the work of God. He traveled among French villages, disguising himself as a simple peddler of lemonade, sometime weaver and shepherd, with the intended ministry to assist priests of the underground. After secret ordination, he celebrated Mass and administered the sacraments under cover of darkness, and at the risk of being exposed, imprisoned, and perhaps executed. He was unintimidated by impending death if his priesthood was discovered, because he was imbued with a resilience that was undaunted by any setbacks, no matter the magnitude.
Once the rights of the French Church began to be restored, Dujarrier was assigned to Rouillé-sur-Loire, where he would minister for the remainder of his life. The state of everything ecclesiastical was so deplorable that where to begin restoration could be easily overwhelming. Not so for the Abbé of Rouillé, who was undaunted by it all. He started with education. In 1806, he gathered his women religious who would teach the young. And then in 1820, he collected the first of his men who would take care of the educational needs of young men. The years of personal privations were taking a toll upon his health by 1820. Gout would impose cruel rule over his body, often confining him to bed for months on end. Though the body progressively diminished in its ability to rise to the needs of his two communities, his mind remained able as he continued to recognize the marvelous abilities of his four brother directors and specifically the potential of Brother André Motet to march the Brothers of St. Joseph forward. It is mutual trust that is the bedrock upon which Brother André and Father Dujarrier lived out 18 years of ministry. Very quickly, they began to think as one individual. As early as July 1826, the Father Founder gives Brother André a very important task. Quote, "Our very Reverend Father, having left on July 16 for a trip that will not end until mid-August, gave me before he left this job, which I am fulfilling with this circular letter, that has as its purpose to invite you to profit by days of grace and mercy that the Lord is going to shine on you in a very few weeks." End quote. This circular letter was sent to all the Brothers of St. Joseph for Father Dujarrier, but with André's name attached as author. In this same letter, André advises each brother to, quote, "offer our respects to your parish priest and tell them that the intention of our superior is to send brothers back to them if they fulfill exactly the conditions of the contract," end quote. He speaks for both of them with our respect, and he is determined to get the day's wage for the day's work as stipulated in the individual contracts. The 26-year-old is, for all practical purposes and by the titles we use today, acting as the first Assistant Superior General. He holds the position of being first among the four brother assistants, two of whom are far older than he. In order for the founder to give over the leadership of the group for 2+ months to such a young man means that he was convinced that André would only provide what he might himself offer. Extreme solicitousness is another trait that characterizes the relationship between the two men and between them and all the members of the young community. It is their sincere concern for and care for each other. In the letter of 1827 from Brother André to Brother Aidan Lagay, André writes, quote, "You will want to tell us in the next letter that you write to Rouillé if you need anything else. Our good Father's intention and ours, the brother directors, is to take care of our dear brothers in all their needs and to supply them so they can perform their duties well. Brother André is well aware that for this army of Christ to be optimally effective, the members must believe that those in charge have their very best interest at heart, especially when all are living and working in conditions of extreme hardship." One more trait that cemented the trust between Brother André and Father Dujarrier is Motet's penchant for exactness in all things.
This attention to the small details is best described in the letter of May 7, 1829, in which Andre provides a detailed inventory of all the items related to the school in Millie. Not one toothpick was unaccounted for. Today, Andre would be described as obsessive-compulsive. Yet a young man with Andre's need to attend to the life and working of this new community makes him an essential cogpin for any operation that wishes to run effectively and to be financially in the black. Father Dujarier died on February 17, 1838. In the memoir for him written by Brother Andre, he describes the 3 weeks prior to the founder's death. Dujarier suffered physical agony, then rallied, only to do so several more times. The founder lived those last weeks with an indomitable goodwill toward all, imbued with, quote, zeal for the house of the Lord, end quote. And I quote now from the memoir. Oh, how many laborious nights I saw him spend in this way. He made himself read almost continually the lives of the saints. He had a particular affection for this type of reading. However, except during the gout crises, he was always charmingly happy. On his bed of pain, when he walked with his canes, and when he was carried in his chair, always happy. When we asked him how he was, he responded pleasantly that he was on his bed, that he was lying down, that he was seated, etc. People in his house had to be very cunning to get news from him about his health. He replied to us almost always with some pleasant, happy, and enigmatic expressions that left us in doubt. It seemed that he did not wish to let it bother him, nor that anyone should be bothered about him. In bed, he responded to letters that he received in abundance from all over. He received those who came to see him and dealt with matters with respect. He gave obedience to the brothers and the sisters. He himself gave them money, making up the itinerary for a trip. Finally undertook enterprises, began them, continued them, and led them to their conclusion, as if he had the most robust of health. His courage never seemed to stagger, and I can say that he was truly worthy of admiration because he often came in unexpectedly in the middle of all this confusion into new troubles like the disorder in some establishments or some subjects, persecution or evil from local people, enemies or awkward people against him. His patience in the middle of all that never left him in spite of his lively and bubbly character. His resignation was proof in all events, and zeal for the house of the Lord devoured him. The 18-year relationship between these two men was not necessarily extraordinary. What is extraordinary, however, is Dujarrier's capacity to extend his hand in trust to a man 33 years younger than himself. Without Dujarrier's desire to engage Mottet in significantly important ways for the development of the Brothers of St. Joseph, the young man might have taken upon himself the self-effacement of simple tasks. Mottet's potential, however, was not only seen, it was nourished and honed, and he was held in honor for 18 years. Maintaining an unbroken bond of fraternal comradeship and mutual leadership, the two men relied upon each other to meet a need of the times, providing educators to train boys to become good citizens not only for this world, but also for heaven.
I want to talk about the vision and the spiritual experience of Dujarier in founding the Brothers of St. Joseph. As some of you may know, I've written a history of the congregation that will be published by the University of Notre Dame Press in December. And when I submitted my manuscript, they sent it out to readers to ask whether it was publishable or not. And I got several pages of comment from each reader. One of the readers said, "The trouble with this manuscript is it says nothing about the spiritual vision or the spiritual experience of Dujardin or even of Moreau. That set me back. I thought, well, I guess that's true. I don't say anything about that. Then I began to ask, what can I add? I started thumbing through a couple of biographies of Dujardin that I have, and I couldn't find there was any spiritual experience. This kind of thing may have been true like for people like Francis of Assisi or Ignatius Loyola or even St. Anthony, the first monk in the desert in Egypt, that something happened, they came across a verse, they heard a voice, they ran into someone, whatever it was, that led them to go about the work of founding religious communities. But as far as I know, that didn't happen with Dujardin. The accounts that have been preserved say that Dujardin, that the priests of the Diocese of Le Mans met in a diocesan synod in 1818, the first time there had been such a synod since the French Revolution in the 1790s. And the pastors were lamenting the poor state of basic education in the villages and country places, and the fact that there was virtually no catechesis of the whole generation that was just growing up. During the French Revolution and even the Napoleonic period, there had been very little attention paid by the government to basic education. Napoleon wanted soldiers, and you didn't have to be highly educated for that. But the pastors prevailed upon the bishop, and the bishop turned to Dujardin, who had founded this community of women who were conducting schools for girls in rural places, and they asked him to found a community of brothers that would undertake to revive the parochial schools in the Diocese of Le Mans, mostly in villages and in country places. Now, the Christian Brothers had a school in Le Mans, but their rule insisted that there should be no fewer than 3 brothers in a local community. And as the bishop knew and the pastors knew, most of these rural communities would be doing well to support 1 brother, let alone 3. So this had to be a different sort of community. So Dujardin agreed to found such a group, and he appealed to his fellow pastors to send him young men who would be worthy candidates to join. And in the summer and fall of 1820, the first 4 showed up, André Motet among them. And the next year, a few more, and then the third year, there were about 10 that came. So the community was off and running. Formation was brief. They lived with Dujardin in his rectory. They ate whatever he had to eat, which wasn't too much. And they were sent out as soon as they could master some of the basic tenets of language and arithmetic and whatever reading to open and conduct these schools. Now, when Moreau took over because of Dujardin's advanced age and illness, he promptly moved the center of the brothers from Rouillé-sur-Loire up to Le Mans and put them in a house that he owned in a neighborhood called Sante-Croix, or Holy Cross, in the city of Le Mans. And he prevailed upon some of his colleagues in the seminary faculty to come and teach courses to the brothers, to get them ready to be school teachers themselves. As you may know, the name that came to be ours, the Congregation of Holy Cross, does not betoken a special division to the Holy Cross, although subsequent constitutions have tried to engender such. But it's rather a reference to the neighborhood where the community was headquartered. And the expression Congregation of Holy Cross might just as well be rendered in French Congregation from Holy Cross. So this pattern of just following one development after another was repeated many times over in the history of the congregation. There's no evidence that Dujarrier or Moreau ever had a grand vision for the community's growth, and as though they were going to fill every diocese of France with Brothers of Holy Cross, or that we're going to staff every school in the Diocese of Milan with a brother or two. That doesn't come up. They had a limited number of personnel. They sent them out as requests came in. They did their best to support them, moved sometimes from place to place. And when it came to overseas engagements, if you remember, Dujarrier was charged with this, organizing this community that would work in France in the Diocese of Milan. But a man named Dupuc, who had been Moreau's seminary classmate in Paris at the seminary of Saint-Sulpice, came to him. Dupuc had just been appointed the first bishop of Algiers in northern Africa. France took over northern Africa, Algeria today, in 1830 as a colony. And he had to organize this diocese, and he begged Moreau for personnel, priests, brothers, sisters, whoever could be sent. And in 1840, as you may know, Moreau sent off the first contingent of brothers and priests to Algiers. They had a lot of trouble. The bishop promised substantial financial support, which wasn't forthcoming. And the Holy Cross people had to be withdrawn after a year or two, but then they went back eventually and were in Algeria for many years. The same is true in Indiana. When Bishop Highlandier showed up, commended to Moreau by his former spiritual director, Gabriel Molebeau, Sulpician, and Highlandier said he had this vast diocese and that he needed people to organize Catholic schools. And Moreau agreed to send a contingent. And the same thing with Canada. Bishop Bourget of Montreal showed up and said the government has finally allowed us to expand our activities. I want to have a school system. I want schools for our youth. Please send me people. And Moreau sent a fairly good-sized contingent of priests, brothers, and sisters to Canada. I can't find any evidence that Moreau had any kind of spiritual experience that inclined him to see Highlandier and Dupuc and Bourget as God's agents. They were people who had a problem in their diocese. They needed help. He could help them, and so he did. I don't find any evidence of a larger vision that Moreau might have thought, well, this will be the beginning of our expansion worldwide. Canada, the United States, Northern Africa, but I just can't come across that. I don't find any clear evidence that Moreau intended to send backup people in subsequent years, but he did. So all of this was responding to a request from the local church to help in ways that he could. And it seems to me that right down to the present age, when we talk about South America, Chile, Brazil, Peru, Haiti, and Africa, Uganda, Ghana, that it wasn't because there was some grand vision, but because the local church was asking for help. And Moreau, or the leaders in Holy Cross, agreed to help. One of the unique stories in this regard is how Holy Cross got to Haiti. The president of Haiti wrote a letter to Bishop Cousineau, or to Father Cousineau, who was the superior general in the 1940s, and asked whether Holy Cross could take over a college that was failing in one of the dioceses in Haiti, the Diocese of Port-au-Prince. And so Cousineau consulted his council, and he and the Canadian provincial, Father Daguerre, went down to Haiti to look at this college. They got there, they paid a courtesy call on the president of the country, and were told that the bishop in this diocese was out of the country for medical treatment, and there was no idea when he was going to come back. So the president said, well, you've come all this way. Why don't you go up and look at Cap Haïtien? It's a popular tourist attraction. And, you can at least do that. So they go up there, and they pay a courtesy call on the bishop, a man named Jean-Marie Yan. And when he finds out why they've come, he says to them simply, you want a college? Take mine. They did. And as Cousineau would later write to someone explaining all this, he said, we had come to pay a courtesy visit to the bishop, and God was waiting for us there. The ways of God, he wrote, are mysterious. We are only his instruments. And as you may know, today Haiti is one of the fastest growing sections of the Congregation of Holy Cross. And so just as with Dujardinier and the founding of the Brothers of St. Joseph, the story of Holy Cross over 2 centuries has been marked by a repeated response to the needs of the church, rather than to the spiritual experiences of our leaders or to some grand vision on their part. If Morrow didn't think that Canada and the United States would turn out to be that important, by 1962, on the eve of the Vatican Council, over 90% of the members of the congregation belonged to one or the other of those 2 provinces. I see Brother Nicholas looking at me because I haven't mentioned Bangladesh. As you may know, Morrow agreed to send Holy Cross missionaries to Bangladesh because he was trying to get papal approval for the constitutions of the congregation. His bishop, Bouvier in Lamont, was always blocking him. And he was asked to send some brothers down to Rome to take over this orphanage, which he did. He went down with them, and that gave him a chance to meet some of the officials in the Vatican and even the Pope. And they said, well, you've sent people overseas. Why don't you apply for approval as a missionary congregation? That'll be easier to get. Your own bishop won't be that much of an obstacle. And so he did. But as you may know, Holy Cross agreed to go to Bangladesh when neither Morrow nor anyone else at Sante-Croix had ever been to India. They had no idea what that was going to entail. They were told it would be easy, 5, 6, 7 people would be enough, but that didn't turn out to be the case. And I think looking back on Holy Cross in Bangladesh in the 19th century, you'd have to say that it was clearly beyond the assets and the personnel of Holy Cross to stay. Things got better in the 20th century, but in the 19th century, it was a bold move. And so I say that the history of Holy Cross is studded, one occasion after another, where these instances where development and expansion depend not upon some spiritual experience of the leaders, but rather are some notion of developing the community into a grand organization around the world, but rather simply the response to the needs of a local church.
The schools of the early brothers of St. Joseph. If there's one thing you should take away from my talk today, it is a realization that the brothers of St. Joseph were not dying on the vine in 1835. In spite of the fact that all Holy Cross histories make much of the dwindling numbers and institutions of those brothers, the fact remains that the brothers were not dying, not at all. Nor were their schools falling inevitably away from them. In 1835, when they passed themselves from the guidance of one priest over to another priest, they were 64 members strong and operating 25 schools. They were not a dying organization. In this paper, I'm going to look at the early schools and try to convince you that the early brothers of St. Joseph in 1835 were viable and trusted as a religious teaching community. The first school was started, as one might expect, in Rouillé itself, the group having begun in that town in July of 1820 with the arrival of the first brother of St. Joseph. It made perfect sense that Rouillé would be the logical starting point for a foundation. Indeed, just 6 months after Pierre Houreau showed up at James Dujarrier's rectory, a grade school was put under the direction of the third recruit, Brother André Motet. André had arrived in October of 1820, and by February of 1821, he was standing in front of a classroom of young boys eager to learn what they could from this man who had been a Larchant farmer all his life and had received rudimentary teacher training from Rouillé's pastor. Given André's later success as a mentor to young teaching brothers of St. Joseph, we can imagine that his energy and enthusiasm would have made up for any deficiencies he may have had in the mastery of math, grammar, catechism, and penmanship, the foundations of 19th century French education. He would be sent the following June to Le Mans for 5 months of teacher training, and then in December to Paris for 6 months of living with the Christian brothers to learn their methodology. On his return to Rouillé in the summer of 1822, he was invested, along with Brother Stephen Gaufre, with a religious habit on the road outside of town. Apparently, Father Dujarrier at the time was not big on ceremony. While André was away studying, Brother Louis Deschênes, Dujarrier's second recruit, opened a school at Saint-Denis d'Orc, and someone, we do not know whom, opened a school at Larchant, Brother André's hometown. The school at Saint-Denis d'Orc had a brother teacher for 12 years, that is until 1833, and the school at Larchant for 8 years until 1829. The school at Rouillé remained under the brothers' direction for 49 years until 1870, a generation after both Brother Stephen and Brother André had passed away. Why were the towns of Saint-Denis d'Orc and Larchant chosen by Dujarrier as initial foundations? We can only guess, but I suspect that Larchant was chosen because the pastor in that town had sent Dujarrier a prime recruit in the person of André Motet. Dujarrier may have felt some obligation to that pastor and so selected Larchant as one of his first 3 schools. After all, Dujarrier was dependent on the goodwill of all the pastors in little towns to send him recruits, so it would make perfect sense for him to give those pastors a brother for the town school. It would be interesting to study the names of the towns that the early brothers came from and match those towns up with the names of the towns where Dujarrier started his first schools. This task would not be difficult because Brother Bernard Gervais's matricule gives the names of the towns where each brother came from, And we have a list of the first schools thanks to a listing in the French monograph Sante-Croix en France. So in 1821, the brothers took over the direction of 3 schools. In 1822, they assumed direction of 7 more, a total of 10 schools in just 2 years, a rather phenomenal endeavor, especially given the fact that in the school year 1821 to 1822, André Motet was not in Rouillé. He was in Le Mans and in Paris. How did the 7 schools opened in 1822 fare? Marsan stayed under the brothers' care for 14 years, and Montorité 13. Saint-Germain-le-Guillaume and Ivry-l'Évêque lasted 9 years. Les Hôtels Saint-Éloi stayed with the brothers only 4 years, Ménil 2 years, and Saint-Pierre-de-Chevillers only 1 year. The town Ivry-l'Évêque may ring a bell with some of you because it was the place where Basil Moreau was stricken with his final illness and had to return to Le Mans to die. There is a school today in that town called Saint-Joseph. It sports a large sign that can be seen from the highway. Where is the site and even the building of the original 1822 school where our brother St. Joseph taught has yet to be investigated. A picture of the school on the web indicates a structure that could very well date to the early 19th century. Today the town has 4,000 people. Its church, Saint-Germain, dates from the 13th century. You are probably wondering how big these little towns really were, or the brothers taught. Today the population of Rouillé is 1,200, and Larchant, Brother André's hometown, 1,100, so they are of comparable size. Saint-Denis-d'Ort today has only 800 inhabitants. Le Mans has 144,000 today. But 200 years ago, the towns around Le Mans would have been smaller, but not by much, because the major industry in the area remains farming. Without industry, locations generally retain population size decade to decade and even century to century. Distances between towns, of course, vary. Rouillé to Le Mans is only 26 miles, but Rouillé to Saint-Denis-d'Ort is 45 miles, and Rouillé to Larchant, 85 miles. Walking at a standard pace, one could travel on foot from Rouillé to Le Mans in a single day, but Rouillé to Saint-Denis-d'Ort would require a 2-day trek, and Rouillé to Larchant, 3 days. Father Dujarrier did keep a horse, so travel times for him would have been cut down considerably. Brothers coming from and going to their assigned schools would have walked or asked to ride in a cart courtesy of a local farmer or tradesman. Keeping track of which brother was running which school would have kept Brother André Motet on his toes, particularly in peak. And he did visit each school once a year to check on conditions. We have, in fact, the inventory he took of the school at Milly, compiled on May 7, 1829, though the film mentioned this. It covers page after page in his ledger and notes every dish in the kitchen and every window fastener in every room. He was a very thorough servant. Dujarrier never made visitations to schools outside of Rouillé. On 2 occasions he attempted such a round of visits, but gave up each time before getting very far from Rouillé. His illnesses, particularly gout, accelerated as he aged. We can imagine that André's visits were anticipated with joy by brothers who had not seen a brother in months. Busy as each one was running a school, they would have had little time for visiting town to town. But there is evidence that some did visit each other, not waiting for the annual retreat in Rouillé, to enjoy some well-earned community. Brother Adrien, in fact, does mention in a letter to André that he has visited one of the nearby brothers. Such visits were encouraged, not discouraged. On the flip side of the handout, you can see that I've circled in green the towns where the brothers were in the neighborhood of Craon, and they are close enough so that they could easily be reached by walking from one brother to the other. The number of schools on the front side of your handout, the number of schools run by the brothers between 1820 and 1835 is as follows, starting with 3 in 1821 and peaking in 1828 at 51 schools, and then dwindling, not dwindling, I hate that word dwindling, but ending up in 1835 with 25 schools. The biggest losses were around the time of that mini-revolution in 1830. So you see that in 1828 there were 51, 1829 they're still sizable at 48, but then the year of the mini-revolution they lost 8 schools, and then another 8 the following year, 1831. But thereafter they stayed pretty much solid around between 25 and 30 schools. By studying these statistics, one has a very difficult time concluding that the Brothers of St. Joseph were falling apart in the early 1830s and thus needed new management. They may have needed new management for other reasons, but loss of apostolate was not one of those reasons. If we select one town to examine with its little school run by a brother of St. Joseph, we might very well select the town Craon. It's on the flip side of your handout. Located 73 miles northwest of Rouillé, the town is 38 miles from Rennes and 74 miles from Le Mans. More importantly, Craon is only 18 miles from Laval. It is 36 miles from Ernay, where a brother of St. Joseph was teaching for 65 years, starting in 1838, long after an aborted one-year stint in 1823. Craon is 27 miles from Sauge, the birthplace and deathplace of the indomitable Brother Gatien Montsemer, who attended the school taught by a brother of St. Joseph in Chemeray-le-Roi. Craon is 25 miles from Chemeray-le-Roi, where the brothers taught for 27 years, 1833 to 1860, and Brother Gatien was there in those years. The brothers took over the Craon Parish School in 1827, the year in which they ran more schools than in any other year between their founding, and 1837, the year of their amalgamation, with a small band of auxiliary diocesan priests in Le Mans. In 1827, the brothers taught and managed schools in 52 little towns, and Craon was one. Founded in the 12th century, the town today has a population of 4,500 people. In 1821, the population was 3,500, so the town has not grown appreciably in the last 2 centuries. The one church, St. Nicholas, was built in the neo-Gothic style, and the small rectory adjacent to the church may have housed the brother teacher, but such a conclusion is doubtful. It was not customary for the Brothers of St. Joseph to live in rectories. They generally rented a room in the town where they taught school. We have ample evidence from letters in 1840, for example, that the brothers teaching in Brooklyn, New York, lived in a rooming house. Teaching in a one-room school would necessitate a great deal of energy and imagination to manage 40 or so boys in all 8 grades. There would undoubtedly be lots of small groups in which older boys could lead younger boys through the math drills and grammar exercises that the older boys had learned in previous years. For some subjects, of course, instruction could be carried on for all 40 boys at once. My Aunt Lucy taught for many years in a one-room school in Illinois. I never got her to talk about that, but you can imagine 8 grades in one little room. But some were easy to teach. For example, art would lend itself to mass instruction, one teacher and 30 or 40 students. We do have evidence of one young brother in Indiana who took great pride in his artistic talent and no doubt his ability to inspire his little pupils to draw and paint happily, if not well. That the brothers remained in Craon for over half a century speaks to both their satisfaction with the teaching situation as well as the satisfaction felt by the parish pastor and families for the brother teachers year after year. It is quite natural to wonder how effective the early brothers of St. Joseph were in their first schools. We do have the evidence of numbers, dozens of schools opened and stayed open, showing that parish priests, city councils, and parents were happy with the brothers' work. Certain brothers did enjoy a good reputation for good teaching. For example, Brother Vital. Letters speak to the excellence, too, of Brother Vincent Peel, who died here in 1890. There is evidence, however, of unhappiness here and there with the quality of the early schools. A letter from the Millitown Council attests to the ineffectiveness of the brother teacher there. Millie questions his lack of pedagogical preparation and notes that the corporal punishment tactics of him would no longer be tolerated. So even 200 years ago, there was awareness that hitting students was unacceptable, revealing more the ineffectiveness of a teacher than the delinquency of a student. At the same time, the very fact that there were some complaints about some brother teachers indicates that community leaders in Rouillé, Le Mans, and Indiana were sensitive to the needs of staffing schools with well-prepared and psychologically healthy teaching brothers. For example, in 1849, Brother Gation writes to Edward Soren the following evaluation of brothers teaching in Brooklyn, New York, that he went to visit. Our brothers, without exception, are incapable of teaching school in the countryside and more so in a city. I said they're incompetent first because none, Brother Basil excepted, has method, and second because they're all ignorant of some branch both essential and absolutely indispensable, or they have flaws which make them incapable of teaching. I could muster all in review for you, and I'd find a flaw which couldn't be satisfied in each brother. Beginning with me, I don't know penmanship, and I'm too deaf for a big class. Brother Victor is absolutely too deaf and too weak in arithmetic and grammar for an upper class. Brother Thomas doesn't know how to write. Brother Anselm is too weak in everything. That's not our Anselm. He was deaf. That's another Anselm. Brother Ignatius is absolutely too simple. Brother Benoit is too singular. Brother Emmanuel is German. Isn't it absurd to watch Brother Lewis give individual lessons in a class of 58 children who make as much noise as our boarders at Notre Dame in one of their ordinary recreation periods? This poor brother understands his weaknesses, but he doesn't know how to correct them, never having received lessons. I tried to regularize his class, although I was as ignorant of method as he when I left the lake, Notre Dame. And I spent the whole week at it. I arranged them as best I could, but Thursday morning I left his students with him in despair, not being able to succeed in establishing silence there, nor subordination, because not seeing clearly or hearing very well, I wasn't able to know where the noise was coming from, and I couldn't understand the lessons they recited to me. In spite of all the disorder and noise in his class, he does have influence and is very calm, not abusing anyone with the whip, which he uses frequently. I don't know why that's not abuse. I guess if you stop hitting them after about 10 lashes, it's not abuse. This is an intelligent and damning evaluation of the classroom situation in New York, and we may conclude that the classroom in this Brooklyn school was not unique. Of course, the pastor of the parish was no help, and I'm going to skip his problems with overcrowding and lack of equipment for the brothers. In France, of course, such situations were more manageable. The distance between Rouillé or Le Mans and the towns where the schools were established was not excessive, whereas to get to New York, Gation had to travel in a sleigh from Notre Dame to Niles. And I'm going to skip this paragraph too about his listen to the itinerary, it's good. Take a train from Notre Dame to, or take a sled from Notre Dame to Niles, then a train from Niles to Detroit, then take a sleigh through Canada, during which segment of his trip the coach overturned and Dacian was almost decapitated. At Niagara, he crossed the river on a ferry in February, then transferred to a train at Buffalo to get to Albany, and finally New York City. It took him a week to get that trip, whereas if you were going to check on some poor brother in a little town around Rouillé or Le Mans, you could make it in a day or two. I gave you the horrible details of the Brooklyn school because that situation was the absolute worst of all the situations that I know about in the early years of the community. People do like to hear about disasters, whereas stories about good teaching experiences bring but some satisfaction to an audience before the yawns start in earnest. When all is reviewed, we must conclude that the Brothers of St. Joseph were superbly effective in their apostolic work. Numbers do not lie, and you have the proof in front of your eyes with the chart of school openings and duration for the first generation of the Brothers of St. Joseph. Even at their supposedly lowest moment, 1835, they were still running 25 schools in France, and 11 of those schools stayed under their care for 40 years or more. The Brothers of St. Joseph, therefore, did not move their headquarters from Rouillé to Le Mans because they were dying. We must look elsewhere for another reason to explain their move north to Le Mans, but that is subject for another paper, a paper that will bring Brother Leonard Guitauget front and center for your consideration.
We want to thank our panelists for an excellent presentation and for being with us today and taking that time out to bring your wisdom to us. And at this time, the panelists will entertain any questions or comments. Yes, Ed?
All three of you, none of you mentioned nuns. In all of my education, I always had nuns involved. So I was just wondering if there were nuns involved with situations that you had seen.
What was the question?
Anybody want to answer that?
What was the question?
That in his education, he had a lot of nuns.
Oh.
And he wanted to know if you had run across any nuns in your research.
Well, sisters of Providence were thriving all over that part, but I don't know any details about their apostolates. They were going full gun for 16 years before the brothers came along. Probably the sisters.
I'm just saying that, for example, when I was in Liberia, the nuns were there also. When I was teaching over at St. Joe High School, there were nuns there. I'm just curious. They really added a lot of good things to the tradition from our teaching.
They didn't teach in the same school. The sisters taught the girls and the brothers taught the boys. Separate buildings.
When you had in 1827, there were 52 schools. How many students would some of them schools have? What would be the max like?
Well, when Brother Robert Mosier went to his first assignment in Brooklyn, New York, he had 74 fourth graders in one room. So there were sometimes in the early brothers schools more than that. They'd have 100 in one room. I'm not sure what the average number was, but they were not small classes. You weren't teaching 5 or 10 boys. You had big crowds of boys.
I know that at St. Columkill in Chicago, we had that school from 1885 to 1897. There were never more than 9 brothers, but often there were 700 students. And the high class would have been considered 90 to 105, and the average size class was about 78. And this is the school that educated Hoban, Archbishop Hoban. and he felt that he got a stellar education, and he started there in the 4th grade. And he stayed there till he was 17 years old.
Richard?
Did the brothers ever were there many that ever were transferred from one school or to another? Or did the school exist because of the brother, and the brother died or left? That was the end of the school.
I wish we had Brother Andre Monte's first ledger book, but it's missing or misplaced in the archives. But in the second ledger book that goes from 1829 to 1836, there is some evidence of lists of brothers and where they were teaching. Those lists would have to be studied to see who was shifted where, but I presume there was shifting, that they would stay in one place until they needed a change for one reason or the other.
I know that at least one occasion, the brother or teacher was withdrawn because the local town council wouldn't pay what they agreed to pay.
Michael?
Yes, regarding Moreau's spirituality, you didn't mention anything about the vision or insight he had in the Trappist monastery?
What was that?
Where he went to the grotto, he was on a retreat or whatnot at the Trappist monastery.
What year are you talking about, Michael?
I wasn't there. I know on our tour when we did our thing in France, we went to the monastery, and behind it was a grotto, and he spent time there praying. This is where he had his insight about the forming congregation. Do you recall that?
What Ron Trump?
I don't.
Thank you.
I don't know that it had anything to do with his taking on the directorship of the Brothers of St. Joseph. Do you?
Following up on that, Father Connelly, I'd like to ask you, since you didn't find anything about the spirituality in Dujari and Moreau, I've often heard the term that the spirituality of Holy Cross is eclectic. Would you care to comment on that? And then what do you think is the spirituality today?
Well, when I speak of the spirituality, what I have in mind that it was an active community, not a contemplative one, that it was not big on corporal asceticism, fasting, eating or starving or any of those things, that it was a matter of saying your prayers regularly and showing up for your duties and for common prayer and common exercise, but it wasn't any kind of special or unique spirituality.
Tom?
George, in the early schools, would it not be possible that some of the students were older than the teachers?
Well, my first year teaching, I was 21, and I had Rick Gagnon, he was 20. So I presume that these guys going out when they're 17 years old or 16 years old, Gation and Anselm were teaching already here in Indiana when they were 16 years old. It's quite possible they would have had kids older than them.
Joe?
This would be directed at George. In listening to the King and Light, but in listening to all three, it strikes me that the definition of education or schools is very fluid. So that when in our time, or anyone my age, you may never have gotten to another school or necessarily known the other brothers unless you came to a chapter. So to some extent, it seems to me that it would be fascinating to say, what held the Brothers of St. Joseph together when in fact we talk about schools, and we range schools, but that would be very, very different from who determines what would be in the school, what you would teach in the school. I guess what I'm saying is that, you think at Notre Dame, if you had money, you would send your kid here. But there's more than the education. There's the atmosphere and the influence. And even right now, the congregation has to look where they're going to have their main influence in this place. So back to George. What would you think would be the most salient or most central piece that held the brothers of St. Joseph together?
Wow, that's a good question. The Holy Spirit. The annual retreat for 2 weeks, they'd get together in Rouvier. I don't know where they all bunked. The Grand Central Steph was a pretty good building, but they probably bunked in the rectory and the stable and whatever. But I think that really kept them together. And there's something about a new enterprise where there's excitement and kind of élan vital that keeps people excited about each other and making a go of something new. I think that they would have supported each other and traded ideas. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of letters that they wrote to each other. The brothers didn't keep letters. The letters that we have mostly from the early days are to Jarriers and Moros and Soren. Soren and Moro had a great sense of history, and they kept letters that the brothers wrote to them. But when Brother Adrian wrote to Andre Motet, he kept that letter because he was at headquarters. But if Adrian wrote to Stephen would throw it away after he read it. Just like today, we jettison a lot of our correspondence. But brothers didn't keep a lot of stuff. They didn't have a U-Haul to go from place to place.
You were saying that a lot of this was for the needs of the time, and it sounds like that in the beginning with the bishops asking for help and things like that. And I presume we come to this day and age right now, so what's going to happen to us? And I think like this virus thing and everything else is going to start to affect what happens to our community.
Nicholas.
You talked about the size of the classes. Now, if the population of these villages are 400, 500,000, your class size, like mine, I come from a village of 500 people. My class size was 12, from 1 to 8. So I don't know, were you talking about 400 students? Is that the total of the whole school?
That would have been in Chicago,
Yeah.
St. Columkille.
Yeah.
And lots of boys.
But I'm saying in the village at that time, the classes were very small, obviously, if the population is only 400.
Yeah, but they had farms all over. Kids would walk 4 or 5 miles to get to the class.
That's true, if they combine villages.
Yeah. So if they had 40 kids from the village itself, 40 boys, count on another 20 or 30 coming in from the farms.
And to George, with the Brothers of St. Joseph, where did they get their training, and how much training did they get?
Well, Jim outlined what the first ones got in Dujari's rectory, and then in 1824, the Father Dujari built the Grand Central Step a couple of blocks away from the church, a building that is mostly still standing today. The chapel's gone, but the living section is still standing, used as an apartment building. But they would get their education at the Grand Central Step, because when Dujari built it, he included in it not just dormitories, but common rooms and classrooms. So they were instructed there, mostly by Andre Motet, probably Vincent, and maybe Dujari walked over for some catechetical instruction.
Yes, Father Jim.
Joe, going back to your question, my impression is that the basic plan for education was reading, writing, and arithmetic. Nothing fancy. Catechesis meant learning to keep the 10 Commandments, getting ready for your first communion. And that first communion may be the last one you receive for several years in the church in that time.
Okay, well, time is marching on, and we want to thank our panelists, and we also want to thank Ed Donnelly for taping this. I think you will be able to see it on YouTube, so it will go viral. And we also want to offer our congratulations to Father Jim Connelly on his book to be made available to all of us in a couple of months, and we certainly would like to have you come back and maybe discuss parts of the book with us later on, maybe post-COVID-19, whatever that's going to be. But anyway, congratulations, and thank you, panel.